The purpose of this video is not to criticize the teenagers and young men who are addicted to video games. It's not. I want to criticize the middle-aged adults who give them encouragement to do something more meaningful with their lives. All right? Because I think we suck at it. I think middle-aged authority figures have so totally discredited themselves that I have to almost give credit to the video game addicts that they've made a sort of logically sound, self-interested decision in just giving up on all this bullshit middle-aged people encourage them to do and going to live in isolation, playing video games, right? The mentality of middle-aged adults is the same when they encourage young people to play video games and when they encourage them to, go isolate themselves and do some other activity that they say is more meaningful, right? Like the mentality of a typical parent in the 21st century. Not all parents, but a typical parent. Really, if you think about this with detachment, it's likely to be most of your parents, most of the time, who have this mentality. Typical parent mentality is sit the kid down in front of the TV, let him play video games. Because as long as the kid's playing video games in front of the TV, the kid is occupied, the kid is pacified, the kid is not getting injured, kid's not getting into trouble. The parents don't have to make a bunch of phone calls. The parents don't have to drive you somewhere and pick you up afterwards in their car. The parents don't have to pay for lessons. The parents don't have to pay for tutors. Think about it from a lazy parent's perspective. What's better, that your kid sits on the floor playing video games or your kid wants to learn how to play the saxophone? All right? If your kid's going to learn to play the saxophone, it costs the parents money. And it also costs the parents time and energy and involvement. Right? Parent at least has to make some phone calls to some saxophone teacher. You have to kind of meet the teacher, decide which one's a good teacher. Maybe the kid takes some saxophone lessons, but then the kid doesn't like this teacher and the teacher doesn't like this kid. Find a different teacher, get them set up this way. Encouraging your kid and being involved with your kid if they're going to learn saxophone is infinitely more work than just having your kid sit on the couch and play video games. And here's the other more fundamental problem for these middle-aged people, in the way in which they discredit themselves. The things they encourage children and young adults to do are just as meaningless as playing video games, or they are even worse. Like, so what's the problem with video games? Problem with video games is Johnny is sitting in isolation just doing kind of a repetitive manual skill, for 3 hours. Here's what you should do, Johnny. You should quit playing video games and go sit in your room and practice playing the violin, practice playing the piano, practice playing the saxophone. You know what would be more meaningful? Would be you sitting alone in your room in a state of total isolation, practicing a repetitive manual skill, right? It's the same problem, but it's even worse. Why? Well, for one thing, video games have a tiny amount of social interaction, right? I mean, we know about this, whether it's through YouTube or through Discord, through voice chat, or just by them going and talking to their friends at school. Okay, playing a musical instrument is more isolating, and playing a musical instrument requires hundreds of hours of repetitious practice, okay? But also, the problem we were trying to solve here, middle-aged people, the problem we were trying to solve was trying to connect these video game addicts with a meaningful engagement with reality. And the abstract world of memorizing different notes from sheet music and then performing them accurately and timing them accurately, right? The world of introducing a young person to the musical compositions of J.S. Bach or, Beethoven or something, that has no meaningful connection with reality. It's just as artificial, it's just as phony and just as fake as playing video games, right? Playing football, playing soccer. Middle-aged people do this with no humor. They're not joking like, playing video games is a waste of your time and it's meaningless and so on. You should try football or soccer or baseball. These are also games. These also do not have a meaningful connection to reality. These also are not about taking responsibility to make the world a better place. And they also involve hundreds of hours of practicing a manual skill in isolation. Right? My grandmother took me once. I'm so glad I didn't get into this. My grandmother took me once to learn to play tennis. mind-blowing this ever happened. You know what she did? So she drove me. It was a long drive, and she puts me in front of a concrete wall. She gives me a tennis racket, and she says, okay, so stand here and practice hitting the ball back and forth against this concrete wall alone. By the way, that particular grandmother, she was not a poor woman. In case you guys are like imagining like some poverty-stricken, urban ghetto with like this concrete wall. No, but that grandmother, my other grandmother worked in a factory, but that grandmother, she was a dentist. She played tennis. It's like, wow, this is what you think raising a child is like. This is how you think you encourage a child to have a more meaningful life. And I was a little kid then. I was still playing video games. Wow, gee, standing here alone, beating a ball against a wall, like, this is worse than playing video games. Like, you've got to give the video game addicts credit. They're kind of making a rational, logical decision where, like, everything they're being presented with, all the options and opportunities they're being presented with, are even worse than video games, and they're making this rational choice to isolate themselves in a simulated world that, yes, I would readily say it's better than watching football on TV. It's better than playing football in whatever pathetic, capacity you may be able to do so in your neighborhood. It doesn't require the huge waste of time and money that's involved in trying to get yourself involved in a football or basketball or tennis league or something wherever you are. And I've known people who do all that stuff with their time. Whatever. I mean, given a set of completely meaningless, isolating, antisocial options, none of which have a meaningful connection to reality, they're making the right choice by playing video games, all right? And the middle-aged people who are having interventions, normally these middle-aged people themselves don't lead any kind of meaningful life. They don't really have any moral they don't have any moral superiority to draw on, right? These middle-aged people themselves may spend their time drinking alcohol, watching football, going gambling in Las Vegas, which it's even worse than video games. If you play video games, I'm glad you're not a gambling addict. Then your life would be completely ruined, right? These middle-aged people, they may have no ground to stand on in terms of moral superiority, but they presume moral superiority because playing video games is so despicable. And all these alternatives, they're actually even worse than playing video games. And, encouragement. It's so easy to encourage people that will really waste their time and ruin their opportunities in life, short-term and long-term, and present it as the greatest thing just because it's convenient for you if you're the middle-aged authority figure giving them this encouragement, right? Like, oh yeah, you should totally volunteer to help drug addicts. Like, oh yeah, you should go, help drug addicts, give them free clothing and food down with this charity. Oh, would you do that also? Would we go together? No. I mean, okay, so now we're getting into something where there's some kind of meaningful connection to reality, right? So this is different. Now we're not talking about tennis. We're not talking about watching football. We're not talking about playing the harp, playing the piano, okay? Okay, so this is a little bit different. But now we get into a different set of problems also, all right? Yeah, for one thing, if this were so meaningful, you'd be willing to do it with me. You'd have some experience doing it, so on and so forth. But what do you think the impact is really going to be on this younger person if they go and start handing out food to homeless people, right? Like, don't you think the impact is going to be like, wow, the world outside my door is really hopeless, really messed up. I'm totally disempowered in relation to it. There's no way I can help these drug addicts live a better life. This is, you see the bleak, stinking, fetid hopelessness of what this is, right? A large percentage of them are going to have this experience briefly and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to go back to my room and close the door and play video games, right? And again, all these things bring with them the question of whether it's the parent or whoever it is, this middle-aged authority figure, are you going to drive them there? Are you going to pick them up afterwards? There's a certain level of commitment, engagement, moving beyond encouragement with mere words where, are you actually going to enable them to do this supposedly positive thing in their lives? And are you even going to do some kind of research to question, to what extent is this positive? To what extent is this meaningful? So I had someone write into me. This guy says he is himself a part of the speed running subculture of video games. He's also part of the video game collecting and game history preservation subculture. And he says that he spends a lot of time trying to talk to these guys These guys who are either video game addicts or just spending a lot of time playing video games one way or the other, trying to encourage them to lead a more meaningful life. What do we mean by a more meaningful life? A life where they're interested in taking responsibility for the consequences of their actions, a life where they're trying to make the world a better place, a life where they have some kind of compassionate engagement with reality, I guess. And, he's asking me, what would I do? What would you do? What could any of us do if you're in this way, if you're close to someone who's playing video games a lot of their time? You know what? I think the truth is what we need here is not compassion, but detachment. I always find it's very easy to broach these problems with people. And he talks about also the difficulty of trying to raise this issue with someone where you don't just get a combative and defensive response. Okay, well, what if you were the parent and you have a child? Would you want your own child playing video games for 40 hours per week? And this is the speed running subculture. So some of these people are playing video games for 40 hours continuously, for 2 days doing nothing. This is a particular subculture. But anyway, let's just say it's 40 hours a week. If you have a child and you're trying to prepare that child to lead a meaningful life or to have a good job or what have you, if you want to make the world a better place, would you recommend that your own child do this for 40 hours a week? That may work with some people where they take a step back, and now that it's suddenly not them justifying their own habit and their own enjoyment, it's them justifying someone else's use of their time. There's a little bit of detachment there, And you could also use this technique with reference to other historical figures, whether they're alive now or deceased. Let's say the person is complaining about Donald Trump. I say, what would make Donald Trump a lot better at these decisions would be if he played video games, if he was speed running Mario 64 every week, for 40 hours a week. Just imagine what a better place the world would be if our leaders were playing video games, were speed running video games, if that was their top priority. Now, again, this is obviously joking around a bit. That can be a way to get past it. But it's no, really think about it. Really think about whether or not the people who have real power, real ability to change the world, whether or not their time would be better spent playing video games than doing whatever it is they do. And again, it may not be a political leader, it may be a research scientist, maybe whatever. And then try to invite people to consider themselves in that context. Okay, well, what do you think is the difference between you and Donald Trump? You probably think you're more intelligent than Donald Trump. And you're probably correct. Okay? We've all gotten to see just how limited the cognitive capacity of Donald Trump was over the last several years. Even if you support him politically, it's going to be very hard to judge who was more mentally limited, George W. Bush or Donald Trump, when this chapter of history is over with, okay? Doesn't matter if it's Donald Trump or some other political figure, okay? So look, you're more gifted than Donald Trump. Let's just start from that assumption. So you're someone, whatever age you are, doesn't matter if they're young or teenager or fully grown man, whoever you're speaking to. Okay, so you know you've got more potential than Donald Trump. You know that when Donald Trump was in high school and university, he's covered up his grades. We all know he got bad grades. We all know he's a dumb guy in various ways. And all his life he struggled with that. It's sad in its way. We all know Donald Trump's a fraud and he wasn't any good at business and he lost a fortune, and all these things have been exposed now on the public record about, really what a kind of pathetic schlemiel Donald Trump has been his whole life. Okay, so you're brighter than Donald Trump. You've got more potential than Donald Trump. But you know what Donald Trump's got going for him that you don't have? Donald Trump is not a video game addict, right? Donald Trump does not play video games for 40 hours a week. And look what he's doing with his time. Again, I admit Donald Trump may be a somewhat surreal example, but, if there's anyone they actually do appreciate outside of the video game world, if there's anyone they look to as having led a remarkable life, a life that's decisively changed the world, that's doing something productive to make the world a better place, here and now, you can say, yeah, and you know what would end that person's career, you know what would change them totally, was if they were playing video games for 40 hours a week, the way you are, you know. Now, okay, neither one of these are perfect examples. There are some people who will reply saying, yes, if they have a child, they're going to encourage their own child to play video games for 40 hours a week. There are some people who reply that way, where they will not have that detachment. There are some people who will come back saying, oh yeah, the world would be a better place if our political leaders or our research scientists would stop wasting their time doing the so-called meaningful things they're doing and would just play video games instead. If only Donald Trump would play video games instead of starting a war with Iran. There are some people who will just double down. But even if my example is inadequate or flawed or poor here, what I'm trying to get at is that inviting someone to consider their own situation with detachment, I think that's really the first step you have to take. Because what you're asking these people to do is to regard their own hobby with some degree of contempt without directly shaming them. Shame is the main tool in our arsenal here, right? Is to, hey, you're wasting time. You should be ashamed of yourself. You're devoting yourself to this hobby that's meaningless, and it's only making yourself a worse person. It's not preparing you to lead a better life. Okay, so you can try using shame, but obviously people who are deeply committed to this, they're going to resist feeling shame. They're going to refuse to feel shame. They're going to try to justify themselves. Or you might say, before they're capable of feeling ashamed, they have to be able to have that detachment where they regard their own situation, they regard their own hobby as pathetic, as bad, as a waste of time. Gee, this is bad for me. It would be bad for Donald Trump. If he were doing it, it would be bad for my own children or my own grandchildren in the future if they were doing what I was doing. Wow. When I don't just think about myself and what I want, when I think about any given person, when I think about what would be good for anyone or for everyone, now I can recognize with some detachment, this isn't good for me, right? And once you can take that step, then you can start questioning what would be a more meaningful life, all right? And I have nothing but contempt for the middle-aged people who will tell you to sign up to do humanitarian work, or will tell you to learn a new language like Chinese without any idea of what kind of sacrifice is involved, without any idea what kind of cost this entails for the person who makes that commitment. All right? A meaningful life cannot just be conjured out of air this way. All right? You've got to start with a lot of sorrow and a lot of yearning. You're going to have to start with days, weeks, months, or even years of just feeling there must be a better life than this, and I don't know what that is. There must be something better on planet Earth than playing Mario 64 again and again and again until you get the world record for the greatest speedrun. There must be something better, and maybe nobody can tell you what that is. When you talk about democracy and revolution, the role of revolution in politics, there are some things in politics that you can be given, and there are some things that you have to take for yourself. All right? Sometimes the people of a country have to stand up and take democracy. There's no way a king can give it to them. There's no way a constitution can give it to them. There's no way, an intervention from the United Nations can give it to them. So, some things can never be given. They can only be taken. And maybe the meaning of life with a lowercase m and a lowercase l, maybe what makes life meaningful for you is of this character, where you have to arrogate it. You have to be the one who demands it. You have to be the one who first feels that you're lacking it, feels a yearning for it, and then gets uncomfortable and goes out to make it happen. All right? And none of this is going to happen if you can't take that first step of gaining some detachment over what video games are in your life, right? If you can't get uncomfortable, if you can't get dissatisfied with yourself, get dissatisfied with the video game, get dissatisfied with life as you know it, yes, but you're also going to be dissatisfied with the middle-aged authority figures who all your life have been telling you what's best for you. Whatever it is you do in your life that's meaningful, that replaces video games, you are going to do it despite those middle-aged authority figures. You're not going to do it conforming to or trying to please those middle-aged authority figures. You are going to rebel against video games at the same time as, and by the same token as, you rebel against your parents, your high school principal, your university professors. Because even though you yourself may be wrong in having invested hundreds of hours into video games, all of them were wrong when they told you to put hundreds of hours into the violin or hundreds of hours into prayer and singing in church and choir. When they told you all these things about what a meaningful life was supposed to be, you know that they were wrong. That's why you rejected their advice and accepted video games. Now you've got to reject video games and reject them as well to find out for yourself what a meaningful life can really be.